Hello ladies and gentlemen, I'm Matt from Matt's Bookshelf, and today we are doing a book review for Dan Jones' Essex Dogs. This is historian Dan Jones' first go at fiction. It came out last year, and Essex Dogs follows the titular company, Essex Dogs, during the 100 Years' War, specifically during the time in which King Edward III invaded France through Normandy along with his son, Prince Edward, better off known as the Black Prince, as they attempt to overthrow the French King Philip and establish King Edward himself as the ruler of France. In the book specifically follows the Essex Dogs, mainly their leader, Loveday, along with other characters such as Scotsman, Romford, and Pismire. And this company is specifically known for its experience in war, and they're known as sort of gritty people who can get a job done. So I actually have a pretty detailed history with Dan Jones. His book, The War of the Roses, which follows the conflict between the Lancasters and the Yorks, was the first history book I ever voluntarily read on my own, because I was going to Oxford for a summer semester and I wanted to read some more British history. And I bought it on a whim, and I really, really loved it. Specifically, what I found very remarkable about Dan Jones' history is his ability to create, to characterize, and to create empathy for these larger-than-life historical figures. Even to this day, 5 years later, I still remember the laid-back, somewhat cowardly King Henry VI, his calculating, brave, but also deceptive wife, Queen Margaret of Anjou, and the even more deceptive, even more self-centered Earl of Warwick. These characters are still stuck in my head because I feel like Dan Jones did such a great job of characterizing them in his histories. And it is through these characterizations, through building empathy with them, that it motivated me to continue reading his books, because I wanted to see what happened to these people, because I really did not know anything about Plantagenet history at the time. So his ability to sort of take the fictional aspects of writing, with regards of creating depthful characters, and then using that as a motivation to keep me reading, to keep me engaged in history that was pretty well over my head at the time, it was very commendable, and I really owe him a lot to why I read so much history today. Also, from reading his histories, I can really commend him for his ability to showcase the actual brutality of warfare. There are times where you're reading these battles, such as in the Plantagenet's book and in the War of the Roses book, where he's just describing these brutal wars between kings that where characters in where like thousands of common soldiers are dying more from the natural landscape than they are from each other being caught in rivers and stuff and drowning. And it gave me at the time such an existential crisis, because thousands of people are dying per battle, only for that said king or queen to be overthrown within like a year. So really, like, hundreds of thousands of people died for basically nothing, and in the most brutal ways fashionable. And it's because during this time period there was such a intense loyalty to royalty, because at the time it was believed that royalty had this divine right to rule, especially in British monarchy at the time, which convinced a lot of common people to follow that, and money, because there really was a lot of income coming in, so they had to go to war if they wanted to make money. And so he really was able to establish a tragedy of these situations, both from like the higher up monarchical perspective, and also like the common person of like, I'm just going to go to war and I'm probably going to get murdered in the most brutal way imaginable. And so again, he was able to use methods in fiction that keep people engaged, and then translating them into history is to keep them engaged. And so that leads us to Essex Dogs, again, his first attempt at fiction. I've been wanting to read this ever since I realized it came out, because, again, I really like Dan Jones, and I wanted to see how his histories translate into fiction. And I'm going to start off with the prose for this book first. The first being what I complimented him for his ability to write battles in The War of the Roses and the Plantagenets, also translates here. Specifically, like the first invasion scene in the opening chapter, where the Essex Dogs and King Edward's forces as a whole are invading Normandy. Again, the brutality of warfare is captured so perfectly here. It doesn't go too excessive like in something like Blood Meridian, but it does do a well enough job of showing, you know, you poke your head out from cover for a second, and then you get a crossbolt in your eye, and then you die. Or you get a knife in the throat, and you drown to death in your own blood. That stuff is here, and it doesn't shy away from the actual brutality, the violence. And it also kind of has like a Normandy, invading Normandy again, like in D-Day sort of feel to it as well. And it's really good. It's really engaging. And I think it did a really good job of establishing the roles of each of the Essex Dogs early on in an effective way that wasn't too much reliant on, I'm the guy who sneaks in, I'm the guy who leads the vanguard, I'm the captain. It was very well done. You get to see each of the individual Essex Dogs' roles in that battle without it being explained to you. Also, Jones's prose is very readable, and this book is 450 pages long, but it's very easy to fly through it because the plot keeps going. The prose is detailed when it needs to be. It's simple, also it needs to be as well. He's not trying to be like Wolf Hall or anything. He's not going for that. He's going for a more traditional sort of way of telling a medieval story, sort of like a Cornwall sort of method, but it's very readable, and you can just sit down and fly through page after page. And not even realize you read 20 pages. It just kind of goes by the blink of an eye. And finally, I appreciate Jones's willingness to editorialize. There are characters such as the Black Prince, who I read Michael Jones's The Black Prince as well. The Black Prince in this book is almost completely different from the Black Prince portrayed in typical history. From what I gather, I'm not an expert on this time period, but and then with other characters as well, he's not really afraid to just kind of like create the characters as he sees fit, and I think that just overall enhances the story when the author himself or herself does have the bravery to go in directions that you wouldn't normally expect in a historical fiction novel. And then this will lead me to the cons of Essex Dogs. The first and probably most damning con of the book is the characters as well. They are very, very generically written, and which is disappointing because, as I said, I think in his histories he's really able to pull out nuances from the real-life historical figures in the War of the Roses and in the Plantagenet Dynasty. I still remember crystal clear in my head one of the battles. Again, this is 5 years ago, so I'm going to struggle with the specifics, but at one point, King Henry VI is captured by his York rivals, and Queen Margaret saves him. And when the battle's over, Queen Margaret finds King Henry under a tree by himself, and he's dancing when he sees her. And this is just like so well built up throughout the book to that point. And the scene is just really incredibly written by Dan Jones, and he does a good job of conveying the characterizations up to this point so that this moment feels very satisfactory, even from a fictional story creative writing standpoint. And he's really able to give these characters tons of depth in his histories, and it just does not show here. The characters here are fictional. All the Essex Dogs characters are fictional, but they just, if you read like any war novel, you just know exactly what they're going to be. The leader is like sort of stoic. He has a bit of a tragic past. His wife died tragically. There's a younger character with secrets. There's a priest who's crazy, and there's a Scotsman who is very belligerent. And it never really, nothing really happened to make you go like, oh, well, I didn't expect this character to do this. No, they kind of just do the thing that you expect them to do throughout the novel. And it was kind of just shocking. Like, I don't really understand how, like, he could find inspiration to keep writing these characters because they're just so averagely written. Again, this is a proposed trilogy, so maybe as the books go on, they'll be given more depth, but I just really struggled to find anything interesting about most of them. There is one scene, I would say, that kind of worked for me. This is going to be non-spoiler review, so I'll talk about this vaguely, but there is a scene where Loveday and Scotsman, who are best friends, basically, of the Essex Company, and they're left on their own in the middle of a battle, and they have to work together to, free themselves from, like, being surrounded by French, and, like, watching them fight together really was a great way of portraying, like, the relationship they have and how much experience they have fighting together without it being told to us, and that scene I thought was really well done. But for the most part, there's just a lot of talking about strategy, and a lot of the characters, especially in dialogue, are not really that distinct. A lot of people swear. They swear gratuitously, I would say. And so when every character is swearing a lot and talking about their bollocks, it doesn't really make any character stand out. And again, it was just very shocking to see how, just how generically written a lot of the characters were. Most of the characters were. I can't really think of a character that really stuck out, except for maybe a Scotsman. I thought he was, again, he's not interesting or, like, innovative in any way. He doesn't really necessarily have to be, but he was the only character where it's like, oh, this guy's talking. Like, I can distinctly tell if the dialogue that it is a Scotsman talking and not anyone else. And for every other character, I didn't really have that, except for maybe the Black Prince. But again, it was just very interesting decision on his part to make these characters just so formulaic. I'd also have to say that the plotting of the book is both overstretched, it's too long, and also underbaked, which is a really bad recipe. Again, this is supposed to be part of a planned trilogy, and the plotting of the novel does reek to me of let's just stretch it out because we have 3 books planned. I'll probably be reading book 2 to see if there are improvements made to the script and their characterizations. But at least as it stands right now, I really feel like the story could probably just be told in one 450-page book and not 1/3 of it told in a 450-page book, because as it stands right now, the characters aren't interesting enough for me to really justify 2 more books of going into what at least as the course of the novels going, at least as the course of the books going on right now, generic character motivations with generic reveals and generic twists, and it's just going to be difficult for me to really justify 2 more books of this, and it might change. I don't really know how people are reacting to this book, so maybe if they are feeling similar to me, maybe Dan Jones will take the criticisms and then evolve upon it. But as it stands right now, the book does reek of, this is going to be a trilogy, so let's just stretch everything out past the point of it being justified. And again, it's 450 pages long, so again, there are just so many superfluous pages in this that I read very quickly because it's well written. But at the same time, I'm looking back, I'm like, how many of those scenes really need to be in there? And I'm okay with scenes that don't push the plot forward. If you have great characters, I'm fine with character building scenes. But when there are no character building scenes, I kind of wonder why the scenes are there. Aside from just trying to add like an epic length to the book that really doesn't need to be epic in length. And so, again, his first attempt at fiction. No one should be judged really by their first attempt at writing fiction. So we'll see what happens in the sequel, but as it stands right now, from a plotting standpoint, I was like, okay, this is so clearly going to be 3 books, and it's so clearly being stretched out for that sake. And my last complaint for the novel, and again, I like the book, but my last complaint for the novel is I didn't really feel like it was immersive enough. This is said in other reviews, but the characters do talk like they're just soldiers from today. There's really no dialogue that feels unique to the time period. There's no celebrations or festivals or cultural things that make me go, oh, that's weird or that's interesting. Like, it just feels like these characters and their interactions if you just swap out some names, it could literally take place in any time period, especially in modern day U.S. wars. So that's kind of a problem. Again, I think of like Wolf Hall and like when Archbishop Wellesley dies, and they like basically in the King's Hall they had this huge celebration of his death where like they show like this actor plays the bishop, and all these demons are attacking him with spears and things, and it's so like weird and horrifying. You're like, how did they do this? Like, how did they get away with doing this? But it's the time period, and that is like a really great way to build atmosphere. And there really is no atmosphere here. Apart from some of the battles, it just feels like war novel that just happens to have swords and just happens to have French and British names in it. And so I was very confused by that as well. And yeah, those are my thoughts on Essex Dogs. If you want to read Dan Jones, I would highly recommend War of the Roses and The Plantagenets. Because again, I think I had high expectations because Dan Jones, I think, is just a really great historian, especially for someone who didn't know anything really about the Plantagenets. Going into his histories inspired me to read more history in general. And then just reading this book, it didn't feel like it translated a lot of what made Dan Jones great as a history writer into him as a creative writing fiction writer. And so ultimately, I think Essex Dogs has the DNA to be great somewhere down the road in Dan Jones's creative writing career. But as it stands right now, he needs to make, from me, significant improvements to his plotting and to his characterizations that he already proves he can do in his histories to make, really great books, and maybe make the books 2 and 3 of Essex Dogs exceptional historical fiction. And so these are my thoughts. I know this book is fairly popular, so let me know what you think of Essex Dogs in the comments below. Just share your opinions. If you disagree with anything, I'm interested in hearing what you thought of the book. And if I motivated you to read the book, I think if you want to read the book, definitely read it. Definitely read it. Don't let me dissuade you from reading it if you are interested in reading it. So yeah, hopefully I'll see you in the next video, and thank you and goodbye.